I spent the first 2 years of my career leaving answer phone messages for people saying, "Hey, it's Anton from Matchmaker. Can you call me back?" And you'd get a lot of curious partners, let's put it that way, phoning up saying, "Well, what's my husband and wife up to?" I remember going through a year where I must have lost more than half the team. And the feedback was, "We love the business case, we love your vision and your ambition, but we're not sure you've got the skill or the experience at this point to execute this." Just because somebody's been successful in one organization doesn't guarantee they're going to be successful in another organization. But you haven't been a hands-on recruiter for 3, 4, 5 years, maybe longer. When did you last sit in front of a client? When did you last take a job brief? When did you last book a job? And it was a real, not confidence knock, but it was a real like sucker punch.
Welcome to Fayl's Tales, the podcast that dives into the raw side of entrepreneurship. I'm Loveth, and I sit down with founders and innovators to explore the failures, tough pivots, and hard lessons learned on their way to success. These are the stories you don't hear, but the lessons you definitely want to take with you. Today, I'm joined by Anton Rowe, who is a leader that takes a truly holistic view of his career and the businesses he's helped to grow. Over 15 years with one company, he played a key role in scaling it to 900 people, launching internationally and even spending time on the ground in Texas, USA, where he picked up valuable lessons and mistakes along the way. Anton has a wealth of experience when it comes to the talent and teams, and not just with hiring, but also building strong groups that work well together. And he tackles this often from a very unique perspective of doing it on behalf of others. He also brings the insights of someone who has stepped in as a second-generation owner, buying into a business after it had already started and navigating both the opportunities and challenges that come with that. Anton, it's so nice having you here with me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me today.
How are you today? And I'm keen to hear about your journey because already today you've had a pretty amazing career by the sounds of things.
Yeah, it's been pretty interesting. I think it's amazing, isn't it? I spend all day talking to people about their careers. But it's not very often I actually stop and think back about my own one. My career in recruitment started just over 25 years ago, actually, back in February 2000, which seems like a lifetime ago now. And I'm always afraid I sound a little bit like a dinosaur when I make the next statement, which is before that day, actually, I'd never been on the internet and I'd never sent an email.
Wow.
So that's
and 25 years on now, we're talking about AI and all these things, which is crazy. You'd never been on the internet.
Yeah. Which I don't think I was. I think I was probably common for my time, by the way. I don't think I was a late adopter. I definitely wasn't an early adopter.
Yeah.
But I guess I talk about this probably a lot more recently because I'm quite interested in the way that technology is changing business and changing our lives today. Yet it's been changing it, I guess, for a very long time. And I'm of a generation where I guess I can remember work prior to technology, I remember sending that first email and phoning the person and saying, "Did you get it?" Which seems ludicrous now, when actually most of our working day, if we're not careful, is orientated around our inbox, whereas back then it was a tool that assisted us in order to do our job.
That's very true. I do think my inbox sort of like guides my life, which is a sad reality. Yeah.
Yeah. And actually encourage people now in my teams just to turn off the Outlook. Because otherwise you're kind of responding to an external influence as opposed to driving your own day. And I often do wonder where we talk about having greater work-life balance now with all the tools and things that we've got. I actually wonder how much more work-life balance we had 25 years ago. And what I mean by that is I would rock up to the office at 8 o'clock in the morning. I'd go in, turn on my PC.
Wait for it to turn on.
That's right, wait for it to warm up, turn on, make a coffee. And then you sort of work till, say, 5:36, turn it off, go home. And that was the end of your workday. There was no email on a smartphone. There was no LinkedIn. There was no other kind of way to communicate unless you really chose to do additional work in the evenings. And that was Monday to Friday. And then you had your weekends. So actually, in many ways, the limitations of technology then, which were still advanced for the time, it gave us more actual work-life balance in some ways.
I've never thought about it like that. And do you think all the benefits we achieve today from technology, do those benefits outweigh the costs and the negatives, I guess, in terms of work-life balance?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think all they've actually done is given us the ability to take our working day and stretch it out over longer, which inherently means we probably do more work than or spend more time working,
not necessarily more quality work.
Yeah, that's right. Or potentially we do spread up our day and do other things and other more interesting tasks. But If I look specifically at the industry that I've spent most of my entire career really in recruitment, what I find really interesting is that if I look at the productivity as a measure of revenue per recruiter, it hasn't gone up in 25 years. Hasn't changed.
Yeah, keen to find out more about how you set foot into that recruitment office. What drew you to recruitment as a career?
That's a really good question. So here's something I don't confess to many people. I was actually working in a cheese factory.
Okay,
And,
in the UK?
In the UK, in a place just outside Tolpuddle on the south coast. And I was at that point involved in music. I was a musician, and
What instrument did you play?
I played the guitar.
Okay.
And sang. And I think I probably left school thinking that's what I would do, or not really knowing what I was going to do. School wasn't really it suited my personality. I think at that point I was probably too curious, and it was probably too structured and too rigid. And I probably had the academic ability which got me through the grades, but it didn't necessarily bring out the best of me. And then I kind of drifted into music, and I was kind of creative and exploring those things. And then I kind of realized that I need to kind of grow up at some point and maybe think about a career, and maybe I'm not going to be in that probably 0.1% of musicians that can make a living from this. And I was looking in the newspaper. It was this is before the internet. So, and I saw an advert for a company, which at the time were called Matchmaker, which
wasn't a dating
do you know,
company. That's what it sounds like.
I spent the first 2 years of my career leaving answer phone messages for people saying, "Hey, it's Anton from Matchmaker. Can you call me back?" And you'd get a lot of curious partners, let's put it that way, phoning up saying, "Well, what's my husband, wife up to?" No, it's not. It's not what you think. They're looking for a job.
Interesting branding, yeah.
And I think, do you know what? It was established in the 80s.
Okay.
And that was probably a relevant recruitment agency type name then. But we quickly rebranded not long after that as Matchtech. And I think what drew me to it was a sales job. I'd always enjoyed sales, very competitive, always been good with communicating, with talking to people, with, solving problems. I didn't really know what recruitment was, I'll be honest. When I first came in, I kind of understood you make connections and sort of put people into jobs. But I guess I learned it was a bit more complex than that. And I met with George Materna, who's the guy that founded that business. And it was a relatively small business then. It was about 15 or so people. He took a punt. Actually, I remember my second interview with George was awful. And I thought I've absolutely ruined my chances here. And he called me and he said, "What did you think?" And I said, I just fluffed my lines yesterday. I couldn't think of the answers. I was, in a rush, in a panic, or I just didn't settle into the groove. And he said, "Well, I'm glad you said that. I'll give you another crack."
Because we're all human. That's really nice.
And do you know what? I think that sums up George as a person and probably the culture of that organization. And it's very competitive. I was suddenly in a job where I was getting rewarded for as hard as I work. I get the reward. And I guess through just purely probably hard work and determination, ended up as the top performer in that business in my second year.
Wow. I mean, I'm not surprised. Yeah.
And it just grew from there. But interestingly, very quickly, probably my third year, I was given the opportunity to run a team, to lead a team, and to grow a team. And again, if I look back now, I think I was probably a horrible team leader. I had no real experience of that. I was probably a bit too cocky, too sure of myself, come off being a very high performer, and definitely didn't have the skills to manage people. I could show them how to do the job by proxy of just vicariously watch what I do and do the same thing. But if I reflect back, probably wasn't really in tune with the humans in my team, and just assumed that everyone had the same motivation and kind of way of coming to work and thinking about the job in the way that I did as well. And interestingly, that team probably grew quite quickly over the first couple of years. And then suddenly I remember going through a year where I must have lost more than half the team.
Wow.
And people were resigning for different reasons, and they were kind of moving off to competitors or leaving the industry. And I remember that was probably a really important lesson for me, because I took it really personally when someone resigned. I remember getting really upset and frustrated, and probably not being particularly nice to that person as well, around their kind of exit from the business. And I don't know who it was, but I remember various senior people around me, experienced people at me at the time, sort of coaching me and saying, this is part of running a business. People will move on, people will go. You can't take this stuff personally. And I think that's something that I've really learned a lot subsequently and over the last probably 15, 20 years of treating people once they've made that decision to move on. It doesn't make them a bad person.
No.
It's not personal. That is just kind of the part of the nature of life. And I think, again, through that time, I probably learned the hard way of losing people and not really focusing on the culture and the kind of vision or the glue, and probably putting myself too much forward as the figurehead of what that team was about. And again, very fortunate to be in a great company that invested in giving me feedback and developing me, and had a great leader, manager, Adrian Gunn at the time, who really wouldn't allow me to kind of get too big for my boots, would encourage me and support me, but would keep me very grounded, and would give me that really quite clear and candid feedback as well.
Wow. It sounds like you were very successful in that role, and you sort of developed very quickly, and you had the right environment and, I guess, key people who looked out for you and helped you develop. And your point on promoting high performers into the managerial role is so interesting, because I also noticed that at the start of my career, where people who were getting the most sales or doing the best work were then given this amazing, managerial opportunity. But A, not everyone wants to be a manager.
Yeah.
B, you don't learn how to be a manager from being really good at your job. They're completely different skill sets. So yeah, those reflections are really, really useful.
Yeah, definitely. I think it was. I look back very fondly on that whole time. It was, working with good people, doing interesting things, and so it didn't always work. There was years that were great, years that weren't so great. Markets we went into that were successful, markets that were challenged. And I think through that time as well, probably went through a series of economic downturns. For example, in that business, we had a team in the aerospace market, aviation market, and that was 9/11 happened. And,
right.
The market suddenly disappeared and no one was hiring into that market. Then we sort of came through the GFC. So different things were kind of going on.
Yeah,
I think through that period as well. And it was also a business that was interesting because it was growing at a rate. I think the average growth rate was over 25% a year. So it was growing very, very quick and organically as well through that period. So it was interesting, again, stepping away from that business and not necessarily realizing that every business doesn't grow at that pace. And I often give that advice now to people when they're starting out in their career, which is, attach yourself or find a role in an organization that's growing fast or growing at a good pace. Because there's no better way to fast track your career than being around growth and success. And it's going to give you opportunities, and you're going to see the sort of pace. And that's not always, as calculated as it can be for someone. But I think being around an organization that's moving and growing, or if a business isn't growing and it's stagnating, move to another business that is kind of growing and moving, because I think you learn so much at the start of your career when you go through those things. Because you have to, right? Because positive change is happening, and it's a constant, and you're kind of trying to keep up with it and develop and evolve with it too.
And negative change sometimes is happening externally, and you're forced to see how leaders adapt as well, and which is learning in itself.
Absolutely, yeah. Actually, I remember back. This has been early 2000s. One of my biggest clients was doing a big project with Ericsson, the telecoms company. And every time I typed Ericsson into an email, Microsoft would auto correct it to the word recession, which seemed quite telling, because I think it suddenly did go into a recession in the telco market not long after that. Which anyway, that's just one of those things. Yeah, that's right.
So you fell into recruitment and you stuck with it and you succeeded. What happened next?
Look, I think just through different sort of journeys, really. Again, being in a business that was growing, my boss at the time, Adrian, he actually encouraged me. I'd grown a team from 2003 through to probably 2008, grown a team from 4 of us up to must have been about 45, maybe 50 people.
Wow.
And he sort of said, where do you want to take this next? Where are we going to go from here? And I went through a process of actually pitching to the board to take my business unit and create a new brand. And to sort of move away from the Match Tech brand, because I'd moved away more from the technical side into more professional services. And remember putting together a really quite detailed business case and pitching it to the board, and the board loved the business case, which was great. But again, I had to take some brutal feedback, and the feedback was, we love the business case, we love your vision and your ambition, but we're not sure you've got the skill or the experience at this point to execute this.
Or in hindsight, do you agree with them?
I completely agree with
Okay.
hindsight. And at the time, it stung. But again, I was very lucky to be in an environment where they basically said, our goal is now we'll hire someone essentially above you that's got the experience, that's been there, but probably not as a long-term hire, maybe as a short to medium-term hire. We'd love you to be part of that, love you to be the 2IC essentially to this person, to grow, to develop, and to get that experience. And again, they brought in a guy who I then worked alongside for a couple of years and absolutely fast-tracked my learning. And again, I had to kind of swallow my pride a bit through that. But I think that's probably been, I think I knew, because the organization I've been there so long, I knew that what that intent looked like. And I knew that it wasn't necessarily a specific failure on me. It was more actually an opportunity to grow. And maybe that's probably speaks a bit more to my mindset. And I relished working with a more experienced person, relished going through that change. And it was enormous. We scaled up. We opened 3 offices within the space of a few months. We probably hired another 30 or 40 people. I learned about how to attract people into a business, how to build a compelling story, how to really go to market with a vision, moving into markets I'd never worked in before, getting new exposure, working with different experiences, levels of recruiters as well. And then interestingly, over the next couple of years, we scaled it up. But sadly, the revenue wasn't growing at the same pace as the cost. So it was growing, but probably not quick enough. And I think, again, I learned through that experience that at that point we were a listed, UK listed business. And when you start delivering results that you're consistently starting to miss, that starts to become a bit of a problem for the board. And I learned through that experience about the importance of, I guess, that rigor in your forecasting and the revenue growth. And then I found myself in a situation a couple of years in, actually, when my boss came to me, or my boss's boss, and said, look, we're going to have to do a bit of a restructure on this.
Wow.
So actually, the guy that we've brought in to kind of sit between you and the board, he's going to step away, and we're going to give you the chance to step up and run this. You built the original business plan. You've had 2 years of learning. You sort of know where the skeletons are buried, so to speak. You had the very, very detailed plan about what you wanted to do. So let's recut that plan and let's do it. And
why do you think they made that decision?
I think ultimately, and this probably plays on to what I've seen more broadly in different business growth sort of subsequently. At that point, I've been with the business probably at least 10, maybe 12 years. And I've been with it from a small business to this. At this point, it's probably 500 people. I knew the culture. I knew what made people tick. I understood the kind of way that the business made decisions, or the kind of ethos, or the ideology. That's a better way of putting it, of the way that the business wanted to run. And the idea was essentially, let's take what we've it's grown out of control. It needs to be cut back. It needs to be reshaped, but we want to reshape it back into the kind of core ideology of what the business stands for. And you know that because you've been here for so long and you understand exactly what makes this tick. And you've now been through this experience where you've learned, you've grown. So yeah, we went on that journey, and actually I related it to sort of my experience since. And my experience since has been about opening up offices in new countries or in new territories, in new places. And every time I've seen that in the recruitment industry be successful is when somebody's gone from the mothership and incubated it.
Okay.
Somebody that's taken the kind of the crumb of the culture,
Yeah.
the DNA of the culture, whatever you want to call it, and then they understand that, and then they've taken that to a new territory and essentially brought that to life. A bit like I suppose when you propagate a plant,
Yes.
right? Whereas I think what happened in that growth cycle is we brought in an external person that didn't necessarily understand the culture and the ethos and the kind of rhythm of the way the business operated, and expected that person then to scale the business. And I think when I look sort of since moving on, as I say, businesses that I've seen have succeed is where somebody has gone, where we've hired somebody external. It's been much harder for that person to really better kind of replicate the success. And that was the tough years, probably one of the hardest years of my life in work, I would say,
Wow.
because we ended up closing 2 of those offices. We ended up probably making at least maybe 15, maybe 20 people redundant.
Is this when you moved to Texas or just before?
Just before.
Okay.
So we cut probably about a third of the cost out of the business.
Wow.
In the space of a few months.
Why do you think the balance sheet was so imbalanced, I guess, between the costs and revenue?
I think we just gone too hard too soon.
Okay.
And we tried to scale it too quick. I think we thought we had stronger relationships and networks in some of those markets than we necessarily did. And I think the other valuable lesson I learned through that process, which I've subsequently learned through sort of academically through organizational psychology, is that just because somebody's been successful in one organization doesn't guarantee they're going to be successful in another organization. And I think we probably put too much weight and emphasis on somebody's track record in another company and thought, they've done that for X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
We can take them from that organization, bring them into ours, and they won't miss a beat, and they're going to build whatever they're going to build, and they're going to generate this revenue. And it just didn't translate. Not in all cases. In some it did, but in other cases it didn't. And I think having the perspective of understanding, as I say, that kind of culture of the organization, I guess I was best placed to look at it and say, look, this person's going to be a good fit here, and this is going to work, and I can see what we can build around here.
Are there any specific things you looked for to make that decision?
I think it was probably that culture was very, very collaborative.
Okay.
It was very much everyone was kind of wedded to the same mission. They had their own piece to play, but everyone kind of bought into the group ideology. They were there for the group probably first, and competitive against the external market, but less so against each other internally. And I think what I noticed with some of the people that we brought into the business, it was more about them, or it was more about them being sort of competitive internally within the. That would be one thing as an example. I think the other thing was recognizing, particularly in the recruitment industry, when we would bring people in and it was quite clear that their success had really been more because of the brand that they worked for as opposed to them individually. So it was recognizing people that had more the, I call it a mercantile instinct, the ability to kind of go and trade and make things happen and build relationships and networks. And it was seeing, really what people had that skill set around them as well. And then through that process, we really essentially centered on a kind of core team at our head office, a core team in London. And then we just intensely wrapped our arms around it. And I kind of handpicked the leadership group, really set out what the vision was going to be. They knew that we had to be very cost focused and make sure that we really not stripped cost out, but we were just cost cautious and really focused on growing the revenue. And it was tough. It definitely took a drain on me, sort of probably mentally, physically.
How could it not?
But it was intense. And I say but, there's no real but to that statement. The results were there. We turned the business around. We got the business back into a profitable return. It was started to achieve exactly what the business wanted it to achieve, which was, I think, probably one of the biggest achievements in my career in many ways. Having seen the project from kind of incubation, developing the business idea, the excitement of the scale up, then it's gone a bit askew and kind of got a bit unwieldy, and then the opportunity to then take that, reshape it, and kind of get it to probably what the vision was. But ironically, I don't think it would have got there if we hadn't gone through the messy bit where it didn't go well.
That's true.
It needed, probably even for the group, dare I say it, because up to that point, we'd been relatively conservative. Despite the business growing at like 25% a year, it was all organic. We were hiring trainees. We were training them up in our kind of way of doing things. We hadn't really hired people externally. We hadn't opened up additional offices. We hadn't gone into new markets. We'd done none of those things as a business before. So I think the group probably needed to go through the experience of learning, getting out of its own comfort zone, and learning what would kind of happen once we did those things as well. And then interestingly, just as that was kind of all coming together, really, that business unit, my boss, who's the CEO, actually moved on, which he'd been my team leader from day one, right? So
I was also going to say it's impressive that you stayed from day one till the end, because often people jump ship or the leadership kicks them out thinking we need a full change. So it's impressive that you stayed on the course.
It was incredible. And then we brought in a new CEO, and he had come from a much bigger global recruitment group, from an M&A type background.
Okay.
And I built a great relationship with him. This guy called Brian Wilkinson, and he must have been 90 days in, and he sat me down and basically said, I think what you've done is really impressive. I think you've achieved so much, and I can see the journey you've been on. But I think you're actually wasted in this role. And
wow.
also I don't see this as a core part of the investment strategy going forward. We're fundamentally a technical engineering recruitment business. You're doing a non-technical bit. So I then moved into a kind of group role where I was looking across bigger problems across the group or bigger opportunities around the way that we executed in our permanent recruitment market, starting to look across maybe some of the CRM systems we were using. And then that's when we got involved with a huge global acquisition.
Right.
And that led me to Texas.
So at this point, you were not sort of like actively a recruiter. You were more managerial and strategic.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Which again is interesting because at the point, a couple of years later, when I moved on and moved to Australia, it actually did me some damage because I got to Australia and I thought, here I've rocked up and I've worked for a FTSE listed recruitment group that's got at that point it's probably £600 million turnover. I've worked for the CEO. We've done M&A. We've done systems. We've done rebuilds of processes. But the feedback I got as soon as I got to Australia is, but you haven't been a hands-on recruiter for 3, 4, 5 years, maybe longer. When did you last sit in front of a client? When did you last take a job brief? When did you last book a job? And it was a real, not confidence knock, but it was a real, I guess, like sucker punch, because you think, wow, you go off and you focus on doing interesting things and building a career. And actually, I think I was again, I'm going to say fortunate that at that point I encountered a Deco Group, and they were looking to actually launch a new business in Australia, a new brand. And that created an opportunity for me to come to Australia, to get sponsorship, and to get involved in launching that business, which was kind of my safe zone. That's kind of what I've been doing. So it wasn't in some ways a huge stretch, because I was also mindful I was moving country and a lot of other things going on as well. So I am
keen to hear more about this Australian component, but I'm conscious that we skipped
Texas.
Let's talk about Texas and that transition.
Yeah.
Especially in markets as well, and culture to some extent between the UK and the USA.
So Texas was a really interesting one. So this was an acquisition that the group had undertaken, the first acquisition, and it was big. Like, it was £60 million we'd paid for this competitive business.
Wow.
And we'd bought them ultimately because we wanted an international footprint. And kind of going back to what I said previously, we'd dabbled with international offices and never made it work, because we couldn't really send someone from the kind of mothership overseas or in country. So it was a kind of strategic move to really broaden and get that footprint and take the business global. That was one of our kind of strategic priorities at the time. So we ended up suddenly with offices in Dallas, Mexico, Colombia, Toronto, Malaysia, China, Singapore, Africa. Like, it was everywhere. And the business that we acquired had been very strong in the telco market, and it was when the mobile phone networks went from 3G to 4G, and they'd basically recruited the teams that built the infrastructure. They built the towers, they kind of did the RF configuration and so forth. So we kind of went in off the back of that. The US was the biggest market. There was between America, Canada, and South America, we had about 70 people. Really profitable business, really successful business. And so it was the biggest piece. I got the opportunity to go across and be based in Dallas and work with that team. And really that job was twofold. It was kind of figuring out what we'd acquired, but also starting to adapt them to the culture of the mothership, of the kind of match tech way, or sussing out how aligned was it to sort of what it looked like. For me, definitely it was a huge personal culture shift, suddenly being in Texas. And then also working with teams across South America and so forth as well. And also just a new skill set of going into a business that I wasn't necessarily familiar with the business of what they were doing, yet was familiar with the entity that now I suddenly owned it. And trying to really build a relationship with the team there, where I was the kind of conduit or the bridge between the two. And also trying to help the board and Brian really make an assessment of what have we bought here.
Yes.
And where is the opportunity? What does that kind of look like for us going forward?
You spoke a lot about culture. What culture did you walk into in Texas, and was that aligned to what you wanted to bring? Yeah, keen to hear about that piece.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I think the culture, I think, in that business at the time was predominantly that. So the business we'd acquired was originally a London-based business, and they'd gone global themselves. And they're, again, consistent with what I've been talking about, they built that by taking a bunch of guys from London and sending them off around the world, and asking them to go and set up in these places. So what I encountered in Dallas, I was expecting to walk into a team of Americans, and it wasn't. It was probably 80% Brits, kind of expats that had moved over to the US, were starting to rebuild their life there or build a life there for themselves. And it was just a kind of replication of London, but in Dallas. And that was just a real clash of cultures. There was very different ways, even down to basics around employment laws and legislations and ways of working. The different models for how we had to engage with clients and how we had to engage with our contractors and so forth. And I would say that the match tech culture that I'd come from and kind of grown up in, as I mentioned, was very collaborative, very friendly, very nice. Everybody looked out for each other. Everyone had each other's back. It was very paternal, if you like, or very I hate that kind of phrase, like a family. Because
it's cheesy, but true, I guess, in this case.
It had that vibe.
Yeah.
It had that vibe. Whereas the business I walked into was the opposite. It was probably a bit more cutthroat, a bit more ruthless, a bit more mercenary, a bit more salesy, a bit more assertive, aggressive. I don't know what the right word is for it. Not in a bad way, but they were just much more, I guess, not orientated in the kind of the kind of match tech way. But at the same time, these guys have gone off to America to sort of set up this business, and their contact back with the kind of head office back in the UK was relatively limited. So they'd also been left to their own devices without really much support, much engagement, much strategy, much leadership.
Okay, and were they succeeding?
They were succeeding to the end that they were commercial guys that were making good income and delivering results and financially, viable and financially successful. But there was no why, there was no purpose, there was no, apart from, we're giving you a great opportunity to move to the US and make lots of money. And I think if I then look at probably what was going on as well, now when I'm just actually reflecting on it as we're talking, you've also got the bunch of guys that are there and their visa's probably dependent on the organization. So it's not like they can change jobs. They're sitting there in this role, and they're not really going to change. They're not going to go anywhere. And they probably didn't need to, but at the same time, does that make sense?
It does, incentives, yeah.
So as a result, it was almost like a cultural vacuum to a certain degree. And that sounds awful because they were really great people and I'm still in contact with a fair few of them as well. But it just kind of needed that, bringing it together, bringing a purpose, setting a plan, understanding where the opportunity was. Because I couldn't really see when I got there how it was going to scale beyond what it was. And it really did need an injection of probably local talent, local people, in all locations as well, by the way, to sort of really kick it on, I think. And I think, sadly, I'm not even sure if the US operation is still active. In fact, actually, it ended up probably with that acquisition not really being a success in the long range. And one of the reasons for that was that business had really been built on, as I say, the shift from 3G to 4G. Well, the shift from 4G to 5G didn't involve anywhere near the same requirement in terms of infrastructure build.
Yes.
So actually, the kind of roles that were being hired just disappeared. I think one of my favorite business books is Who Moved My Cheese?
I haven't read that one, actually.
You don't know Who Moved My Cheese? Okay.
No.
So I'm going to go right back now. So right back in my first few years in recruitment, I had a big project with Ford, and I was placing a bunch of engineers into Ford, and they're working on a new model vehicle. And the project finished, and all my contractors that were working there, where I was getting all my revenue from, were all due to finish up. And I remember sort of complaining about this to one of the contractors and frustration of, I'm going to have to go and find a new client. I'm going to have to do this. A couple of days later, Who Moved My Cheese turned up in the post. And it's you can read this book in an hour. And without giving away too much, the story of two mice. They live in a maze. They wake up every morning and there's a huge block of cheese. And they basically eat the cheese and then they go back to sleep. And then one day, one of the mice sort of thinks, oh, hang on, this cheese is getting smaller. What happens if I wake up one day and there's no cheese? So he will eat and then he'll go off and he'll hunt around the maze to find other cheese. The other mouse says, this cheese is always going to be here. So he just goes back to sleep. And eventually, of course, they wake up one day and the cheese is gone. So the first mouse just goes off in the maze because he knows where the other cheese is because he's kind of gone off and looked for it. And then the other mouse is, Who moved my cheese? And has a hissy fit and sulk and gets pretty upset about the fact that the cheese is no longer there and doesn't know what to do about it and hasn't gone off and kind of found other cheese. And I say it's a silly, it's a lovely analogy and as a book, and it's a little bit more complicated than that. I'm giving you the abridged version, but I still come back to it today, like 20 odd years on.
Wow.
And I still reflect on it often. I will talk to people about, who moved my cheese. Like the market's always moving. And that's a great example in that situation where the business had been very successful off the back of the 3G to 4G integration. And then suddenly you get a 5G and there's no cheese, right?
And we're expecting the same thing.
You keep kind of going back to the faucet to drink, so to speak, and suddenly it's not there. So I think, and that's probably, again, if I reflect long range 25 years of my career, that's a trend, that it's very easy to get comfortable thinking, well, these consumers and customers are going to continue to come through the door because they have. And look, you see that in all industries. Look at like a Blockbuster Video or a Kodak, right? As in their business model is exactly the same. Consumer habits change, technology evolves, or the world moves on. And that would probably be what was going on. But I think at the time when I was in the US, we didn't necessarily have the foresight that was going to happen. There was still a bit of 4G work going on. But suddenly the client were talking to us about different types of roles and different types of hiring in the future. And now, like I say, look back with the benefit of hindsight, you realize that actually the business, whilst it gave probably Matchtech Group or the international footprint, they didn't maximize it because the actual opportunity that they'd acquired suddenly was no longer there.
Yes. How long did you spend in Texas?
Probably just over 12 months or around that kind of time.
A lot happened in that time, clearly.
Yeah, there was a lot going on, and a lot of the time I was there, I was really probably, more of a group role, not really recruiting, but more looking at what we bought, making sure that the right legal processes were in place. I remember going to meet with a US lawyer when I was there and showing them the employment contract that we gave to our staff to say, is this fit for purpose? And the US lawyer just laughed at me and he said, in a country that's probably the most libelous country in the world, you've managed to create legislation or a contract that doesn't even need to exist. Wow. When you sort of see on the news it's on the news, on the TV or on a movie, and they'll say, you're fired, right? You can actually do that in America. Your employment is at will. You don't have an employment agreement. You have a letter of a hire, and it doesn't guarantee you employment.
Which is obviously different to the UK, I'm guessing.
It's very different to the UK, which is like Australia, where you have an employment contract and agreement, and you can't, just willy-nilly fire someone on the grounds of discrimination or whatever in the US, but their employment is at the will of the employer. But yet we managed to create employment law because we created an employment contract in America. So it was all those kind of learnings, and it was just working through all that kind of stuff and organizing the team and starting to put a vision together and so forth. But I think I realized through that time that probably I've been at that point almost 16 years with the group. I'd left the UK. I was in my late 30s, about 37, 38 at that point, and thought maybe there's something else. Maybe there's something else I want to go and explore, want to go and do. Sort of a few things going on in my personal life as well. And Australia presented an opportunity. So I came here in 2016 with Adecco, which is what I kind of touched on. And that was great. I enjoyed working for Adecco, but I learned quite quickly that being in a big global corporate really wasn't for me. It kind of reminded me of being at school, being a bit rigid, a bit structured, not really probably trying to launch a business in a global enterprise. It's very hard to have agility, very hard to be able to maybe make decisions on the fly. And I just don't think those kind of businesses are maybe set up for starting something probably from scratch in the way that it needed to be done.
For sure.
But I enjoyed my time with Adecco, and again, I built some great relationships, and it gave me a good landing in Australia to get to know the market, to get to know kind of what things look like. And then, through that time, that's when I found myself with Marshall McAdam, or Ember.
Wow. Before we dive into that,
Yeah.
keen to just recap on the lessons learned from that first experience from being in the UK, then the US. If you could summarize in sort of one or two sentences, what were the key takeaways?
I think, and again, this is something I learned as well, or I built on academically and learned through the kind of organizational side of things, which is first and foremost, and this wasn't just from being in America, by the way, this is also from having teams in Mexico and Colombia and Canada and so forth, that there's so much cultural variation in the way that different nationalities think, act, different sort of traditions about the way that work.
Yeah, even in
takes
the
place.
Western world. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And I think you would think in the English language speaking world of, say, the US and the UK, it'd be relatively similar. But I'll give you a great example. I think when I got to America, I realized that people were really wanted to validate your credentials in America. They really wanted to know where you went to school and what you studied and who you knew. It was very, and this may be Texas specifically, it's a very big country, but you had to kind of substantiate who you were in order for the person to kind of want to work with you. And in some ways, doing business in America was very much more traditional in that context. Whereas I feel in the UK, if you could do the job and you turned up and you had the products and services, people were going to work with you. But probably still defined by the output of the work that you could provide.
And I would much prefer the UK version personally than the Texas, but yes, a bit more merit based.
Yeah, that's right. And again, interestingly though, I discovered, and I'm probably jumping ahead a little again, but when I got to Australia, I had to relearn that again. And I found myself probably conditioned to the American way of being. And I remember getting here and going out on the first few sort of client meetings and stuff, and naturally talking about my credentials. And then people sort of looking at me a bit strange, as in that doesn't impress me.
No, you're being a bit cocky or yeah.
Yeah. And I had to unlearn that again and realized, okay, to do business in Australia, you need to ask people, where their kids go to school in Melbourne and what coffee they drink and what they think about house prices and which AFL teams do they barrack for. And you have to build probably first and foremost a relationship or a connection or invest in the relationship with somebody. And then you can kind of bring it into the, hey, let's work together. So again, everywhere's got its own kind of uniqueness. And I think that's probably what I learned the most or surprised me. I just assumed the world of business worked the same regardless of which kind of country you rocked up into. And so don't get me wrong, I would assume if you go to do business in Japan, for example, it would be starkly different to UK or but I think maybe because you're in a non-English language speaking country, you'd be more in tune to that. If that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It makes a lot of sense. We have covered a lot. It's been very, very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and your perspectives. I think you've given a lot of people food for thought. And yeah, I would not have thought that someone coming from a recruitment background could, bring such diverse perspective to failing, I guess.
Yeah.
And it's interesting hearing it from the perspective of someone who's an employee and has grown with a company and kind of like moved through different phases with growth, expansion, contracting, and then growth again, and with different markets and countries and cultures. So thank you. It's been great having you with me today.
That's okay. My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. This is Fayl Tells, real stories and real lessons. If you enjoyed this episode, share with a friend and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also watch the full episode on YouTube and make sure to follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and LinkedIn to see more clips and get behind the scenes content. Bye.